From NPR, this is Justice Talking.
Well, I think Grand Theft Auto was a fluke. You know, once people knew that, you know, in this game you can pick up hookers and use them to replenish your health and then beat them to death with a baseball bat and steal all their money, that's going to make them say, ooh, I got to see that for myself.
There have been 1,000 media stories that said, you know, video games were responsible for Columbine, for the various shootings, because, you know, the two people were gamers. You're actually saying that's true?
The accessibility combined with these violent video games is a very dangerous recipe.
The military uses video games as a training tool to train people to kill because it is realistic and because it can desensitize people.
It feels a bit alarmist to me to use the word violence to cover everything. And it would be like using the word sex to cover people kissing each other on the cheeks.
I'm Margot Adler. We'll debate video game violence after the news. From the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, I'm Margot Adler. Welcome to Justice Talking. Here are some facts about violent video games. Advances in computer graphics have made the games bloodier and more realistic. The fantasy world you enter seems almost real. While many of the games are rated like movies, that doesn't keep them away from kids. They've been blamed for everything from the Columbine shootings to childhood obesity. And yet, a university study recently concluded that first-person shooter video games can help build reflexes and peripheral vision, and some psychologists argue that violent fantasy play helps kids deal with anxiety and fears. Several states are trying to regulate the sale and rental of violent video games to minors. Here's Gordon Black from KUOW in Seattle.
As he does most days when he gets home from school, 13-year-old Kyle Romaine heads to a computer set up in the dining room of his family's Seattle home. Although it's warm and sunny outside, Kyle won't be shooting baskets. Instead, he's taking aim at Nazis. Using a mouse and keys, Kyle blasts away at German soldiers in a game called Medal of Honor. As with movies, video games are rated according to their suitability for children. The entertainment software industry gives a teen rating to Medal of Honor, which is set in World War II Europe.
Sergeant Harrison, Pathfinders, 101st. Good to meet you, Sergeant.
There are these Flak 88 guns, these big artillery guns, and I'm trying to destroy them so more people can survive. Well, you can die, but I'm just too good.
Kyle says his skills are the result of playing a couple of hours a day, but that's not what his mom says.
He probably plays 3 or 4 hours after school, and if I let him, he'd play all day, all weekend. Never get off, hardly.
Bonnie Blanchard Romaine dislikes the sound of gunshots. She forbids Kyle from playing games at home designed for older teenagers. They carry a mature rating, rather like an R movie. Stores are not meant to sell or rent M-rated games to teens under 17. In theory, that puts the nation's best-selling game, Grand Theft Auto 3 Vice City, out of the hands of players like Kyle. But a friend has a copy, and Kyle plays it regularly.
It's fun. Actually, the shooting is kind of fun. It's one thing. And it has really good graphics also.
In Grand Theft Auto, those good graphics include scenes like a decapitated character spewing blood. Despite the blood and gore, Kyle disputes that game violence makes teenagers aggressive. In fact, he says some of the mildest kids he knows play violent video games every day. But study after study implies that there is a causative link between exposure to electronic depictions of violence and increased aggressive behavior in children. In 2001, the American Academy of Pediatrics issued an unequivocal statement saying that media violence, including video games, was a significant risk to the health of children and adolescents. Social worker Kristen Rogers believes that violent video games have more influence on kids than TV or movies.
They are identified with whatever the character is that they're playing. So they're not just watching somebody shoot someone on a screen. They're doing the shooting, which really reinforces that behavior much more. They see a roadblock in their way in a video game, and the way to solve it is by being aggressive and violent. In real life, when they see a roadblock, that's the first way to solve a problem that they're going to think of.
Well, when you were a kid, did you ever play Army with your friends? And did you ever pretend that you shot each other and you died?
Joanna Alexander is CEO of Seattle game developer Zombie.
So that's a very interactive way of practicing killing other people, and yet it hasn't seemed to have a terrible effect on their adulthood. It hasn't been shown to cause particularly bad behavior or a tendency towards violent acts later on.
Alexander says games are just a convenient scapegoat, and the real issue is parenting. A voluntary agreement between the game industry and anti-violence activists is designed to help parents. It's supposed to prevent kids under 17 buying or renting M-rated games. But not all stores are complying. Earlier this year, Mothers Against Violence in America sent teams of youngsters to shop for violent videos in the Seattle area. 12 out of 13 stores sold the violent video games to minors.
Even kids as young as 10 or 11 could get the mature-rated games.
Representative Mary Lou Dickerson is a Democrat in the Washington State Legislature.
As a mom, as someone who's worked with at-risk children, I said, enough already. We have to do something about this.
So Dickerson wrote legislation that now compels retailers to card youthful shoppers aiming to buy or rent certain M-rated games. The law applies to games that show harm to realistically depicted law enforcement officials.
I purposefully made my legislation very narrow, and I showed the compelling interest of the state by connecting it with police officers.
The Washington law is just the latest in a number of efforts around the country to restrict violent video games. In June, an appeals court threw out a St. Louis County ordinance that banned minors from playing games containing sex and violence. The court ruled that the games were accorded free speech protection. But Dickerson says the industry is more interested in profits than free speech.
They don't give a rip about the First Amendment.
Whether or not video game producers really care about their First Amendment rights, the rest of us ought to, says Doug Honig, Communications Director of the American Civil Liberties Union here in Washington.
The First Amendment protects freedom of speech for entertainment, and it certainly applies in this situation. Video games that are violent may be despicable. Many people may find them highly offensive, but courts have made very clear that they're protected form of freedom of speech, meaning that it's not the role of the government to come in and say, no, you can't have access to this.
Honig says questions of access to violent video games should be left to individual families. As in previous efforts to regulate video games, the courts will have the final say. In July, a federal district judge in Seattle issued a stay delaying implementation of the new law. Both sides will get to argue their case in a hearing expected to take place in September. For Justice Talking, I'm Gordon Blank in Seattle.
With about $10 billion in annual sales, the video game industry is roughly the same size as the film business. According to one report, the games are as common as bicycles in American homes with children, and kids are spending more and more time at the game console, 13 hours in an average week for a 9th grade boy. Do the games make kids more aggressive or not? Both sides can point to studies to back them up. I'm Margot Adler, and we'll debate the subject of kids and violent video games here at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia on this edition of NPR's Justice Talking. I'm joined by Daphne White, the founder and executive director of the Lion and Lamb Project. A former journalist with 20 years of experience covering children, families, and education issues, White founded Lion and Lamb in 1995. She describes the group as a national grassroots organization dedicated to stopping the marketing of violence to children. Jerry Jones is also with us. He's the author of Killing Monsters: Why Children Need Fantasy, Superheroes, and Make-Believe Violence. He's been involved with several aspects of the entertainment business, from translating Pokemon cartoons to developing creativity workshops for children and adolescents. Both Jerry and Daphne are parents. Thank you both for joining us here on Justice Talking.
Thank you.
Daphne, you've decided to spend your life crusading against violence in toys, media, and video games. Why do you find video games so dangerous?
Video games are interactive, and they consume, as you said, 13 hours of an average, I think you said 9-year-old's life. And they're the preferred form of entertainment, especially for boys. Children are leaving toys earlier and moving into electronic media, and much of what is marketed to boys is violent.
Jerry, your book, Killing Monsters, takes the debate in a completely different direction. What do we miss if we concentrate on the negative aspects of violent video games?
We miss what might be positive about them, and we miss why people like them so much, why people who, for the most part, are quite decent and very well socialized, and in a lot of cases, in some genres and media, very mild and it may be even a little over-constrained, really enjoy these fantasy trips into mayhem and heroism and invulnerability.
Daphne, one of the things that Jerry argues is that children use violence, see violence, much differently than their parents do. Aren't parents imposing their own fears and judgments on kids who may not see these games in the same way?
I would say no. I started this work, as you said, I was a journalist for 20 years, and then I had a child who happened to be a boy, and I saw what was being marketed to him. What I found as a journalist, and what anyone can find if they go and read the research, is that every single medical professional, child association has found that viewing violence, playing with violence for most children is harmful, leads to aggressive thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes.
Jerry, do we really know that?
There's a tendency when a medium is new, or it moves into a sort of a new level of violence, or it enters our home in a different way, to become worried about it. I think it's very understandable anxiety. But in trying to seek a scientific or medical statement that covers the whole phenomenon without asking, how does this fit into our culture? Why do kids like it? Why do most of the kids who enjoy it so much turn out so well? We're only looking at one issue. We're going in with a bias. What's wrong with this? Let's find out what's wrong with this. And we're failing to ask some critical questions.
I would have to disagree. As a mother, I would much rather listen to what health professionals have to say about my child's mental health than people in the popular culture who have a financial stake in marketing violence to children.
Doesn't constant exposure to the worst violence in video games and other media desensitize people to human emotion and pain? And doesn't it increase fear?
It doesn't seem to be the case in a sort of a real-world perspective, and this is the sort of thing that unfolds with time. But in terms of a broader effect, I think that it's very important that kids have some place to go and pretend to be big and strong, pretend to be invulnerable. It's very important that everyone have a place to go to do the things they can't do in real life, to explore the forbidden a little bit.
Daphne, what's the difference between playing with G.I. Joe, playing cowboys and Indians, shooting water pistols or Nerf guns? What is the difference between these kinds of toys, guns, and so forth, and violent video games?
I think you said you went back to the 30s and how there have always been cultural critics and people criticized Elvis Presley, etc. True, we have come a long way from Elvis to Eminem. And as far as the effect on society, as far as violence, there is an increase in road rage. There is a decrease in civility. We have more people incarcerated as a percentage of our population than any country on earth. We have a higher level of violence than any industrialized country.
And you're blaming video games?
I'm saying that as a culture, we have a real acceptance of violence as a way to solve problems, both in real culture and especially in popular culture. And the two are connected. When people grow up, people our age as well as our children grow up watching cartoons on TV since they're really little, where you beat people on the head, you throw them against walls, you throw them down cliffs. That is seen as funny, humorous. When you grow up like that, yes, you're going to have a society where violence, when you get angry, you go back to childhood behaviors.
But what is the difference between, let's say, G.I. Joe, cowboys and Indians, shooting water pistols, and actually the comic book cartoon characters that I saw as a child that were bopping each other over the head all the time and everything? They were pretty horrible.
They were pretty horrible, which is why many of today's... Well, a number of things. They were pretty horrible, and that's why I'm saying a lot of adults and parents and even psychologists are desensitized because we grew up with that, number one. Children did not play Army 13 hours a week. It was one of many things they played while they ran outside, while they felt safe. When they needed to play Army, they played their own Army. Now they're not. They're playing Spider-Man, they're playing media images, they're playing comic books. That's the difference.
I disagree that we're losing our civility. I really think that this is something that it's the sort of anxiety we have, the sort of the world's going to hell anxiety, that seeks evidence to support it. But I think in so many ways it's different. I think in many, even if you look at crime rates and so on, in so many ways kids now are behaving much better than in the late 60s and 70s. And there's also a shift in our attitude toward violence, toward the normality of violence. I was reading my son Rascal by Sterling North a while back. It's a very cute book about a boy raising a raccoon. He's 10. He was 9 at the time, and there was a passage there where his big sister made him dress up in kind of a Lord Fauntleroy clothes for church. And the line was very simply, he said that all my friends made fun of me, and it took quite a few fistfights to win their respect back. And my son was stunned by this. He didn't know what sort of childhood this was. But if you look back, there was a real acceptance of that sort of everyday brutality in American life. Boyhood was essentially about fistfights and throwing rocks. And what we've moved toward in recent decades is teaching kids to control their impulses, teaching them to use their words. We do a lot more crisis intervention. We're trying hard. I think it's a good effort, and I think it's working fairly well. We're trying to make ourselves less violent.
You're listening to Justice Talking. We'll get into the audience and hear your comments when our debate on violent video games continues after a short break.
Have you visited the Justice Talking website lately? It's worth the trip. You'll find an incredible archive of 100 debates on everything from the death penalty to the insanity defense, fat discrimination to reparations for slavery, gays in the military to women in sports, and the list goes on. Drop by anytime and just listen to Justice Talking at www.justicetalking.org.
Welcome back to Justice Talking. I'm Margot Adler, and we're talking about violent video games. We sent a reporter to this year's Electronic Entertainment Expo, the video game industry's annual trade show, and asked those in the retail end of the business whether parents appear to understand the ratings. The voluntary rating system is the industry's key weapon in keeping games out of the hands of young kids. Justin Wood, a sales associate at Target, says parents act pretty clueless when it comes to the M, teen, and E ratings on game packages.
At E3, you not only learn about cool games, but where gaming is going.
Parents really don't know what it is. They're still looking for age difficulty games, like, oh, it's an E game, so it must be easy for my kid. It's a teen game, it must be good for a teenager. So I think there's still some misunderstanding about the way the rating system actually works.
What does labeling achieve? Does putting the label mature on video games limit kids' access to them? Many parents buy kids whatever they want, and if they buy them violent video games, should the government get in the way? We're coming to you from the Wistar Institute at the University of Pennsylvania, where we've got video game playing kids and involved parents here with us. What do you all think?
Hi, my name is Jerry. I'm from Philadelphia. I just wanted to try to dispel a few logical fallacies by Mr. Jones. First of all, the argument that these games help reflexes and peripheral vision is a nonsensical cop-out, no pun intended. We could have games that test reflex with acts of kindness, for example. Secondly, the thing about supply and demand, that it's the consumer-driven, is also nonsense. We don't see porn, hard porn, at checkout aisles in supermarkets. We have that put in the corner somewhere with covered properly for adults. That's number two. And number three, that there is a big difference between today and the 50s. Even though they may not have been simpler times, the kids today have easier access to guns. They're bringing guns to school. We didn't see that in the 50s. That's why you have the Columbine, the assassins in Virginia, and et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, wait a minute. Do you, let's put that one right out there. I mean, you can answer all of them, but, everybody, there have been 1,000 media stories that said, video games were responsible for Columbine, for the various shootings, because, the two people were gamers. You're actually saying that's true?
The accessibility combined with these violent video games is a very dangerous recipe.
Do either of you believe that Columbine had anything to do with video games?
I believe it's a correlation, not a causation. I don't think you can do a one-to-one relationship between any crime and any video game or even a product. But I do believe, or I would not be doing this, that there is a correlation between the values and the stories we tell young children and what they act out if they're mentally imbalanced, when they're angry, when they reach a breaking point. Of course there is. I mean, Columbine looked like a movie or a video game.
It's important to remember, though, that the rampage shootings, this sort of you take a bunch of weapons to a public place and shoot people, were really basically an adult invention. It sort of started with the University of Texas shooting in the 60s, and there have been a series of copycats who have followed this. And obviously there is something here that is expressing a certain kind of lone male rage. What we need to look at is what is this male rage? What is this relationship with violence we have now? What is this sort of tinderbox situation we've created where people seem to feel so pressured and so ready to explode? And then whether it's from their own imaginations or from the news media or from some entertainment, what is taking them to that point?
Now, Jerry, one of the things I was struck with in your book was you wrote that kids often see a gun as a magic wand. Mm-hmm. Explain that.
Well, kids get into the point the finger bang bang thing before they have any real sense of what a real gun is, and certainly long before they have any of the anxieties or the political sense of what a gun is that grown-ups have. For them, for this shooting thing, for a little kid, is about shooting power across space. It's about making something happen at a distance. You point your finger, you make a noise, and a grown-up pretends to fall down and pretends to die. And that's a very exciting, powerful thing for a little kid, and it's also very reassuring to learn over and over again that this is in fact pretend. The person gets back up.
And you don't think there's a confusion when this is translated into a violent video game where AK-47s and pistols are shooting people and leaving them in a pool of blood?
I think the way to help people separate fantasy from reality is to let them have their fantasies and then talk to them about what reality is. But it actually becomes further confusing if you lay that anxiety on a kid, that this thing that you are pretending to do, it looks like a real threat. I think that only makes it a little more difficult. It's something else for them to dig through and try to make sense of.
I couldn't disagree more, and I really resent all this talk about anxiety. It's not about anxiety. It's about marketing, okay? It's not... Yes, war play and playing with toys and having power over the world has always existed for children. It is a necessary part of growing up. And I once actually emailed an anthropologist in Africa. Someone emailed me about, what about kids who live way out in Africa where there's no television, there's no marketing? Do they still pick up sticks and fight with each other? And he said, yes, they do. So, children do have to act out these things, but there's a difference between some of what you're talking about, which is really children acting out their own needs and fantasies when they need to, and what parents are concerned about, which is the marketing of violence to children.
Daphne, shouldn't parents be the one to set the limits on what their children can play with or watch? Why should the government get involved?
Of course, parents need to be responsible, but it's about marketing. These things, the reason I started Lion and Lamb was I noticed even though I was trying to be responsible, I didn't want my child to see these images constantly. I didn't want action figures and violent video games marketed to him at every turn. They were. We're waiting in an airport. There'll be commercials on for products I don't approve of. You're watching the news. There'll be commercials. So, yes, parents need to be responsible, but there are hundreds of billions of marketing dollars going to market to kids. And unless you keep your child locked up in a closet, which I believe is child abuse, your child is going to be marketed to, and that's why we need help. And by the way, we do not oppose the marketing of any video game to adults. We're only concerned about the marketing of adult violent fantasies, unlike any that we saw as children, to young children. That's what's changed. It's the level of violence and the young age of the child that it's being marketed to.
Jerry, do you believe in any regulation of video games?
Well, first, just to talk about marketing for just a second. We're together on the sleaziness of marketing and the inappropriateness of much of what is sold to kids. And I think that's something to work on in various ways. But it is important to remember that the marketing follows the market. In the comic book business back in the 50s, the most successful, the best-selling genre was silly humor, things like Heckle and Jekyll and that kind of thing. The second most was romance comics, and anything that had to do with violence, like superheroes, came down quite far. So they marketed what was selling. They marketed what the audience showed an interest in. And obviously this is a venal decision. This is a money decision. The marketers, of course, want to take the appetite for action and adventure and channel it toward a particular product. But the desire for the superheroes, for the fighting, for the shooting, for the action adventure is audience-driven.
Let's go into another question.
Jack Fish from Devon, and a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. Can the two speakers talk a little bit about the difference between violence in fantasy games like Batman and Spider-Man and violence involving on tape what appear to be real people performing gory acts against each other?
One of the difficulties I have with the debate about violent entertainment in recent decades really, is that this word violence, the V word, is applied to so much. Almost anything involving some sort of physical conflict becomes called violence, and the violence that comes to mind often is the worst. If you say there's a lot of violence in cartoons or on TV, people immediately imagine dismemberments and blood spurting, and there are things that are not appropriate for little kids. But I think when we take that V word and stretch it out to cover things like the Power Rangers or Superman or Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, then we're really doing a disservice to the people who like it. We're doing a disservice to the people who like Roadrunner cartoons but don't like Grand Theft Auto. I think you have to just start using different words. I think you have to stop. It feels a bit alarmist to me to use the word violence to cover everything. And it would be like using the word sex to cover people kissing each other on the cheeks.
That was Jerry, and before we turn it over to Daphne, I just want to put a thought into the mix. I remember seeing Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It takes place on Mars. There are women with 3 breasts. There were probably about 150 people that were blown away, and it wasn't until the second time I saw the movie that I even realized that anybody was killed, because it's a science fiction fantasy. And for whatever reasons, those kind of fantasies don't hit me as being problematic. I then saw Silence of the Lambs, and there was a moment when, there was a graphic scene of humans interacting with humans in a violent way, and I was creeped out for weeks. And so I think there are distinctions between what we might call fantasy violence and real graphic violence. What do you think, Jeff?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's also news violence. That's something to remember. We don't talk much about what harm watching the evening news might do to kids and adults in terms of their worldview.
What about you, Daphne?
Actually, I agree with Jerry. We don't talk about it, and there is an awful lot of violence in the world, and they don't understand the difference between the news violence, the Afghanistan violence, the West Bank violence, the Iraqi violence, and the violence on a show, a docudrama, police drama in the evening.
I think what we can't forget, too, though, is one of the functions of entertainment, fantasy, play, is to work through the things that are making you nervous in real life. And as kids are anxious about real violence that they see or have heard about, there's often an increase in wanting to play through it in some safe, controllable form, a game or a movie that they know is going to end well, and maybe watch it over and over again so they can see repeatedly that it ends well.
Margaret, if I could just say one thing, this is really key. I think the key difference between me and Jerry is that everything I deeply believe is that violence is not entertaining. He just used the phrase entertainment violence. Yes, there's violence in the world. Yes, children need to work through the violence they see, but they don't need it done in an entertaining way. They can work it out through play, through their own make-believe. Children can pick up a stick. They can pick up Legos. I've heard moms tell me their child, if they don't give them violent toys, will take a toast and chew it into a gun. Children will find a way to deal with these issues. And we really need to eliminate this concept that violence is entertaining, because if you talk to anyone who lived through September 11th in New York, they can tell you it was not entertaining, even though it looked like a movie.
This is NPR's Justice Talking. I'm Margot Adler. My guests are on opposite sides of the debate over video game violence. If you go to our website, you can get more information about gaming and tell us what you think online at justicetalking.org. Before we return to the audience, let's go back to the Electronic Entertainment Expo in Los Angeles, where we talked with a reporter for an online gaming magazine.
Well, I think Grand Theft Auto was a fluke. It sold really well due to the negative attention it got. Once people knew that, in this game you can pick up hookers and, use them to replenish your health and then beat them to death with a baseball bat and steal all their money, that's not something that's going to cause most of, your average gamer or, even just, your average teenager to go, ooh, that's a bad game. I better stay away from that. That's going to make them say, ooh, I got to see that for myself. And then they'll go out and spend the $50 to do it. And I think that's how the game sold so well.
What do you think? Would that make you or your kid go out and buy this game or one like it? How many of you in the audience have played Grand Theft Auto Vice City? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good quarter, third of the audience here. Before we go on to more questions and even some questions from people perhaps who've played it, I'd like to ask our guests a series of short questions. These are questions that we'd like a yes or no or one-sentence answer. I know that's difficult. Should violent video games be available at public libraries? Jerry.
I think public libraries have to respect the ratings, and I think video games that have action and conflict in them but that are E-rated can be in the kids sections.
Daphne?
No, I think libraries are for reading. I think children need to read more, and they can play video games at home.
Recreation centers and after-school programs, same thing?
I think so, especially considering that a lot of kids can't afford these things, don't have access to these things, and you don't want to create this access problem. You don't want to have this piece of our culture, piece of what is very important, I think, part of our youth culture now, unavailable to kids who don't have the things at home.
Daphne?
I agree that games rated E for everyone and T for teen should be at recreation centers, but not games rated M for mature unless they're in a separate room where adults go, I guess I'd say.
Daphne, have you played Grand Theft Auto 3?
I've not played it, but I've watched it being played for hours, and I can tell you as much as you'd like to know about it.
Did your adrenaline shoot up?
I found it. I found a lot of it boring.
Yes
I found
or no?
it shock. My adrenaline, no.
Jerry, have you played it?
Same thing. I've watched. I'm not very good at video games, but I have. I got to watch someone do it.
Has your son played it?
No, I wouldn't let him do that. He's 10, and I don't feel that that's something to get to yet.
What's your favorite video game, Daphne?
Some that my son played when he was younger, and I'm really disappointed and upset that there are no really good. Actually, his favorite right now is DDR, Dance Dance Revolution. I guess that's his, where you actually
and
dance.
Your
My favorite video game? You know, I haven't found one that I like. I've been to E3, I've looked at him, I can't find one I prefer to a book.
Least favorite?
My least favorite? Probably Grand Theft Auto 3 because it's been so popular, because it pushed the envelope, and because it's where people want to go.
Jerry, your favorite video game?
Don't have a personal favorite because I don't really bond with the medium at a personal play level that much. I enjoyed my son was playing something like War of the Monsters. It was a kind of a Godzilla, King Kong, monsters smashing cities thing, and he loved that. He got a lot of joy out of it, and I could see that it was a good part of his fantasy life at the moment.
Your least favorite?
I have a lot, as Daphne does. GTA is a bit of a problem for me, especially when I think of a lot of young people playing it. I think that there's
Grand Theft Auto for those of you who don't know.
Pardon me, yeah. I've been talking about this so much. I think there's a real place in our culture for this kind of shock entertainment, this sort of teen upset mom kind of entertainment. I think that's a real thing, but it upsets me.
Okay, going on. We want short answers here. Name one thing that your parents wouldn't let you do when you were a child in terms of media in the broadest sense.
My parents only let me watch half an hour of television a day.
Jerry?
Well, this is kind of why I wrote my book. My mom wouldn't let me read comic books for years, and I finally got to them at 12, and it was a phenomenal discovery. It was one of the best things I ever went through to discover the Hulk and Spider-Man and these characters.
What's one rule in your house that your kids object to or find ridiculous, Daphne?
I will not let my 15-year-old play mature-rated games, and my son is incredibly bright. He's in a magnet program. He knows all the research and quotes it back to me and says, I know the difference between fantasy and reality, Mom, but no, he cannot play mature-rated games.
Do you think he does it anyway without you looking?
Not in my house, and actually not in my house, but I can tell you that when he was younger, I was really impressed. Once I went to pick him up at a friend's house when he was maybe 8, and the friend was playing a game I would not have approved of, and my son, who wasn't expecting me, I was early, was standing behind him, and he made his own rule, which is he could watch, but he knew I didn't want him to play, and I really respect his integrity, and I still trust him on that.
Jerry, what one rule in your house does your kid object to?
We're starting the same discussion, but he did some serious questioning of why I didn't want him to see things like Grand Theft Auto 3.
Let's take another question here on Justice Talking. We're talking about violent video games.
Hi, my name is Hadley, and I'm from Long Island, New York, and I'm a student at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. I'd like to direct this question to Ms. White, if I could. You would make a comment before about parents need to set limitations when it comes to violent video games, and how do you propose that they should do that when we're in an age when, both parents are working and they're out of the home and they're unaware of the amount of media content and what the actual content is that their kids are exposed to?
I think parents need to teach their own values to their children. So they really do need to talk to their children like I do and like it sounds Jerry does about my message to my child is violence is not entertaining. It is not okay for you to kill people in a virtual way in my house.
I'm Margot Adler. We'll find out what America thinks about violence in video games and other entertainment after this break.
Justice Talking is made possible with support from the Annenberg Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands, the Pew Charitable Trusts, investing in ideas, returning results, www.pewtrusts.com, and The New Press, publisher of the Justice Talking audiobook and CD series on web censorship and school vouchers, available at justicetalking.org. Hotel accommodations in Philadelphia are provided by the Sheraton University City Hotel. For reservations, visit Sheraton online at sheraton.com/universitycity. If you're a high school teacher, a student, or a parent, you'll want to check out our new website, justicelearning.org. Justice Learning gets young people interested in the constitutional issues that affect their lives, like free speech, affirmative action, and juvenile justice, and shows how each of the institutions of democracy, the courts, Congress, the presidency, the press, and the schools, affect the issue. It's civic education in the real world at justicelearning.org.
It's NPR's Justice Talking, and we're talking about video games. It's not news that the Army has used video games to help train soldiers, but just this year, the Army released its own free video game where kids can play soldier, protect the homeland, and try out the military as a career. Is this a problem? In just a moment, we'll go back to our audience here at NPR's Justice Talking and take some more questions for author Jerry Jones and activist Daphne White. But first, I wanted to get a sense of whether the public is concerned with violence in the media, including video games and other forms of entertainment. I called Frank Newport, editor-in-chief of the Gallup poll.
Do Americans think that violence in various forms of media affect their children?
They do. The limited data that we have on that shows that people think that is an issue, but probably not the most important issue affecting their children today when we talk about various things like crime or Columbine-type events that occur in high schools.
But when they think about events like Columbine, do they link that to video games, video violence, media violence?
Yes, they do. In fact, a year or two ago, we actually had a poll following one of those unfortunate shootings. Not Columbine, but there was another one where students were killed in California, gave people a list and said how important you think each of these is a cause of these types of school shootings. Number one was, interestingly, home life. Then the ease of getting guns was seen as very important. But third in the list was portrayal of violence and use of guns in entertainment and music today.
So I would think in line with this, most Americans would think that it's more the parents' responsibility to shield children from violence than, for example, the job of the media to not promote it.
things like labels on music, even labels on video games and all those types of things. The public has gone along with that, and in some instances have said they would agree with some kinds of restrictions on sales of these types of materials to kids under 18.
You said that there was some feeling that violent movies, CDs, video games should not be sold to children under 18. Did you get numbers on that?
Generally speaking, for everything that we tested, we had 83% numbers, 63% numbers along those lines who said that there should be actual restrictions on sales of different types of violent materials to children.
Is there anything else that you would like to add from the data you've seen?
Whenever pollsters float this idea to people that there's too much violence in media, be it CDs or be it video games or be it movies, the public agrees. They're concerned. There's no question about that in all of our polling. And as I've mentioned, the public seems to be willing to go along, at least in some of the older polling, with the idea of more information, more restrictions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margot.
Frank Newport is editor-in-chief of the Gallup poll. So, Daphne, Jerry, brief comment in reaction to what Frank just said. Jerry?
I understand that there's a concern about the material and that people want more information and ratings, which I think is good. But what bothers me then is when people will take these things and write bad legislation knowing that they have a fairly sound body of people who, without really thinking about it or without really studying it, have arrived at an opinion.
Daphne?
I'm glad to hear that the majority of American people agree with our position that the marketing of violence to children should be restricted. I would also like to say that there's a bill in Congress right now that Congressman Joe Baca from California has, which would which would make it illegal to sell violent video games to children, like the Washington State bill. And the video game industry is doing everything in its power to stop that bill and is suing Washington State. And every single time regulation is mentioned or proposed, the video game industry funds it, fights it, which again is why we're concerned about the marketing and the money issues involved.
Before we return to the audience, I'd like to take you inside a video game, courtesy of radio producer Dave Clements of the Be Connected Technology series.
As a member of the Star Wolf Army, I've been enlisted to disable the Blood Eagles military installation. While other members of my team are going to defend the base, I'm going to make a run for their flag. Since I'm outnumbered, I'll drive a tank to penetrate enemy lines.
Interesting story, great sound effects, which we love being in the sound business. There's not any doubt that some of the video game stuff is art, so shouldn't it have some constitutional protection? Daphne, how do you deal in the law that you're proposing and also the ones that have passed with the free speech concerns here?
First of all, I'm not proposing the law.
Well,
Congressman
the law
Baca was
saying,
supporting.
Oh, it's going to be great. It's going to,
Well,
why
yeah.
isn't that going to be struck down too?
It may or may not be struck down. I mean, the two lower courts, there was a similar law in Indianapolis and in St. Louis. It's interesting that both lower courts, federal district courts, in both cases supported a county's right, a government's right to protect children from this kind of material. The circuit courts have disagreed, but it's not a First Amendment issue. It's an issue of marketing to children. Adults will still have the First Amendment right to purchase this material. We don't object to that. It's just the issue of marketing it to children.
We're going to take another question here on Justice Talking. If I can get to him.
Hello, my name is Ankur. I'm from Albany, New York. We looked at an earlier clip, and basically in the clip it stated that the rating system was voluntary. And seeing as corporations are taking these voluntary measures, aren't they being responsible? And more so, I think, and if not, what really should they be doing?
Well, no, they're not.
Daphne?
They're not being responsible. The Federal Trade Commission did a survey about a year ago where they sent children to buy adult-rated games into mass-market stores. 78% of children walked out with games like Grand Theft Auto, Halo, Doom, Quake, violent video games that, according to the industry's voluntary rating, should not be sold to children under 17.
Daphne, I have to butt in here with a very funny story that happened when my son walked into the local game store and tried to buy a Grand Theft Auto 3 Vice City. And he was with a friend, and I only heard this later. It was right out of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, and he basically had his friend go into the corner of the store with a cell phone and said, yeah, I'm going to call my dad. And he took out his cell phone and called his friend, because the store actually said, no, you can't. You need your dad's permission. You need a parent's permission. But the store
store guy actually saw the kid in the corner with a cell phone, and so wouldn't sell the game to my son. And they were thinking up. They spent hours trying to figure out ways that they could get around the store. But actually, in fact, in this case, the storekeeper actually was
one of the 12%.
Jerry?
I want to say what troubles me most about the legislation, or what happens when you start to open that door. And the Washington law is one that troubles me a lot at that, because what the Washington law specifies, as we heard, is that you cannot show a law enforcement officer being harmed. And that seems like an easy one. That seems like sort of a slam dunk. How can we oppose that? But then I think of things like The Matrix, which is a political critique of sorts. It's a kind of a lame-brained adolescent political critique in a lot of ways. But nonetheless, it has a point.
Wait a minute. I have a book called The Matrix and Philosophy. It has 20 different philosophy professors.
Did you see the Matrix movie, the second one?
I did.
And you thought it was philosophical?
I did.
Tell me one thing you remember from it that has more than 3 syllables in the sentence.
The first one has a great deal.
The fact is, the fact is that there are philosophy professors that are teaching The Matrix in their class. There are books that are being taught, which means that at least there are complex issues that are underneath all
and
this.
here's
The
my
first
point.
Matrix, yes. The second Matrix, no.
It's, I think, a very adolescent, appropriate political critique. It makes you think, well, what if we are all being controlled by an evil computer? What if what we see is not really what's there?
What if we're all being marketed to constantly?
And
what if the Matrix is a marketing machine, which it is?
But these thoughts can get going. I mean, this may be one of those critiques that ends up backfiring on the people who market it. But the point is, it is a political critique. There are things being said, and it's relevant to adolescents, and it's at a level that adolescents can get. What if the person who looks like a police officer is, in fact, an agent of this evil force? And what you begin to get with, for example, the Washington law,
right?
what you get with the Washington law is a state legislator beginning to dictate content, beginning to say, we cannot tell this story. You cannot bring to adolescents this idea that the state might be something evil, or that what passes for authority might be something evil. And that is very troubling to me.
Teens do not operate at the same level of adults. I think it is very dangerous to give teens message that the state might be evil and that police officers might be evil. That's a very confusing message.
Let's go on to another question here on Justice Talking, where we're talking about violent video games.
My name is Lawrence P. Barnes. I'm Temple University. There's a lot of talk about playing, and there's a lot of research to support that children really learn from playing. And as a result, you have video games that teach children to read, playing video games, and math. You even have video games to help children with attention deficit disorder. Play attention is what it's called. My question is, since it's important for children to use play to learn, what are they learning from violent video games?
I think
Let's start with Jerry.
It's important to remember there's multiple purposes for play. One is that you play house when you're little, because you know that you'll be in some sort of a house family situation. You're kind of rehearsing. You also play good guy, bad guy, cop, robber. You play monsters. You play lions and dinosaurs. One of the really important functions of play is to do the things you don't get to do in reality, either because you're too small and powerless, or because you know you're not allowed to, and there's something kind of interesting and exciting about the taboo. And I think that if we try to take that away or try to narrow that too much, I think we're just kind of adding to the tensions and difficulties of learning to be good kids and learning to be good people.
I think, again, Jerry is confusing the issue. Yes, children need to work out these issues, but they can work it out themselves. It's different from feeding them products. Children do learn through play. Everybody knows that, from Maria Montessori on. They do learn skills and values through play, and what violent video games teach is that violence is fun, violence is power, violence is how you get things done in the world.
Jerry, what about the issue of gender? Is this a boys' thing?
Not entirely. It's more so. But one thing I found when I worked on Pokemon, it was interesting to see that more and more girls were getting interested in this kind of material. And the girls tend not to go for the big gore or the really intense suspense, generalizing, of course, but they tend to go to stories that have conflict, and they have heroes and villains and wins and losses. One of the issues girls have had to deal with generation after generation is not being given many opportunities or much permission to figure out their own aggression, to explore those feelings. And I think this is a place where pop culture may actually be helpful with things like Pokemon and Harry Potter, too.
What about teaching boys to be nurturing? I mean, why do we need to get girls to be more
Pokemon
aggressive?
had
What
that,
about
too. And
nurturing
again, I
values?
don't mean to make everything about Pokemon, but it's a material I worked on and know well. One of the aspects of this fantasy, and this is one of the reasons I feel it was a great fantasy for kids, including the violence, the fighting, is that it was also about training and taking care of your little pocket monsters. And it was a very complete, not entirely, no, it was a very complete fantasy, and it hooked into kids at many different levels.
Let's take another question right now.
Hi, my name is Tina Mehta, and originally from Easton, Pennsylvania. My question is, obviously we're talking about here how violence is being marketed in these video games and whether it's being just or not, but where does this violence stem from? Like, why is violence such a central part of our culture? And it has been since almost the 30s, 20s, when you gave examples of the cowboys. And
How about the dawn of time?
Exactly. So where has this violence stemmed from, and why is it such a central part of our culture today?
Violence is easy to sell, it's easy to produce. Explosions get people's attention. Killing, I mean, it's a very primal thing.
But I mean, Grimm's fairy tales, the Bible, Shakespeare, it's all full of violence, right?
Yeah, but it's full of violence and other values. A lot of other myths and values which have been taken out of popular culture, and it's very black and white. Here's a bad guy, let's go kill him, and that's the whole rest of the movie.
Daphne White of the Lion and Lamb Project and Gerard Jones, author of Killing Monsters, Why Children Need Fantasy, Superheroes, and Make-Believe Violence. Thank you both, and thanks to our audience here at the Wistar Institute on the University of Pennsylvania campus. We invite all of you listening to continue this debate online at justicetalking.org. And before we say goodbye, I'd like to leave you with this thought from the Greek philosopher Plato. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. I'm Margot Adler. Thanks for listening to Justice Talking. This is Margot Adler with a brief update to our program. We taped this Justice Talking debate during the last week of June. 2 days later, the Entertainment Software Rating Board created 4 new categories of parental advisories, largely in response to the public outcry over Grand Theft Auto 3 Vice City and other ultra-violent games. According to the New York Times, cartoon violence will be defined as when a character is unharmed after the action has been inflicted. Fantasy violence is when the actions involve characters and situations easily distinguishable from real life. An intense violence label will be applied to graphic and realistic-looking depictions of physical conflict that may involve blood, gore, weapons, and depictions of human injury and death. A 4th designation, sexual violence, is defined as depictions of rape or other violent sexual acts. And starting September 15th, content warning labels will be more prominently displayed on the front label of video game titles. That's all for this edition of Justice Talking.
Justice Talking is a production of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, which is directed by Kathleen Hall Jameson. The program is produced by Catherine Colbert, Julie Drizzen, Steve Mencher, Cara McGurk, and Aaron Mooney. Gary Kalman is our communications director, and Marvin Lee is our webmaster. Engineering by Indre Recording Studios. Special thanks to the National Constitution Center for their sponsorship. This is NPR's Justice Talking. Support for NPR comes from NPR stations and the Freedom Forum, a nonpartisan foundation dedicated to free press, free speech, and free spirit for all people. The Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, online at mott.org, supporting efforts to promote a just, equitable, and sustainable society. The Kresge Foundation, building capacity of nonprofit organizations through challenge grants since 1924, on the web at kresge.org, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, on the web at macfound.org. This is NPR, National Public Radio.
Restorative justice focuses on the crime victim and the community. The daughter of a murdered woman meets with her mother's attacker. A community circle mediates between a father and son. One Minnesota prosecutor has given up on this process, claiming that it steals resources from more effective methods of justice. I'm Margot Adler. Join me next time for NPR's Justice Talking, when our subject is a new approach to crime and punishment.